Good morning. I'm Neil Quilliam. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House and a former Durham graduate. So delighted to be here, at least virtually, if not in person. Sorry not to be with you this morning. It's a little bit beyond my control, but I'm glad that I am here and we can have this discussion and conversation. Of course, I don't have the luxury of knowing what's been said over the past day or so, so do forgive me if I repeat some of the more obvious things that have already been covered, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for that. I would like to thank Professor Etishami for first inviting me to take part in the conference, so I'm delighted that he's done so, and secondly for allowing me this opportunity to speak through camera to the audience. Thanks, Anush, much appreciated. I've got about 10 minutes, so I'll just try to get my main ideas across in that 10 minutes. And they are that the GCC has intensified relations with the Asian countries over the past 10 years. This has primarily taken the form of increased trade and investment, a strengthening energy relationship, both in terms of oil and gas exports, and investments in downstream joint ventures in Asia, but also in the GCC states themselves. We've also seen a lot of diplomatic traffic between the GCC states and Asia over the past few years, indicating a strengthening partnership. My main argument today is that whilst we can expect economic ties to continue to strengthen, cooperation on diplomatic and security issues will probably lag far behind. Those circumstances are likely to whet the appetite for closer cooperation. I recall thinking through the implications of the US shale revolution on GCC-US relations back in 2010, when academics and analysts started to question whether the US would draw down its interests in the region. And we asked whether GCC leaders would turn to Asian powers to provide the security umbrella. I wondered at the time how those GCC leaders would effectively transfer their trust away from the West and towards the Asian leaders. However, my thinking has developed or changed somewhat since 2010 and has been informed by Professor Niblock, certainly, and also colleagues here at Chatham House, one in particular, a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, when they have pointed out that, in fact, the issue of trust may actually more come from the Asian side. That former ambassador I've referred to described a number of visits that GCC leaders made to Asian countries, only to return with the impression that they, Saudi Arabia and the GCC states, were more seen as a pumping station more than anything else. Now that gives us food for thought. So the question is when and whether the relationship between the GCC states and Asia will pass a threshold and surpass its transactional phase, that's where we are today, into something more enduring. Without question, the relationship is growing. But the question is, can it take a different form? That's something I just want to think about a little bit today and touch on some of the key areas in the relationship. I want to highlight some of the growth areas. But before I do that, I just want to say that economic relations between Western governments and GCC states has always been a little bit complicated, particularly by the role played by the private sector. It's never been absolutely clear when a GCC government's dealing with a Western government that large corporations, businesses are completely separate from government. For example, it's very common within the GCC for BP to be seen as a branch of the UK government, or of course the BBC on that matter, to be a branch of the UK government. It's not always that easy to draw those things apart. However, when we talk about GCC relations with Asian parastatals, it becomes much clearer. As it was put to me in a workshop recently in Riyadh, we prefer to deal with government-to-government relations. So if that's a Sinopec or a CNPC, ultimately it becomes much easier for GCC governments to deal with that. That's a trend we can see emerging, and one that's likely to benefit both of those countries. Anyway, I want to touch on the growth areas, as I said, and they've been driven by two major global developments. One is the one that's familiar to all of us here. That's the rise of Asian economies. Driven by China and India, we have seen their combined economic weight grow from 4.7% in 1990 to 17.8% in 2013. That is a staggering increase. Of course, this has been accompanied by a significant increase in Asia's total energy demand, from 2,000 million tons of oil equivalent in 1990 to 4,000 million tons oil equivalent in 2011. That's a doubling of energy demand in just 20 years. That's profound. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, expects that oil demand will increase from 90 million barrels a day in 2013 to 109 million barrels a day in 2035. That's a jump of 19 million barrels a day in less than 20 years. The important factor is, however, that Asia will account for 88% of that increase. Again, that's a staggering figure, a staggering number, and it shows just how important the GCC states will be for the well-being or for the economies of Asia. Absolutely essential. Maybe not just a pumping station, maybe a lot more, but certainly the role of pumping station is an important part of that relationship. The second factor driving this is the US shale revolution. Now, a lot has been said about the US shale revolution, so I don't want to spend time looking at that now. But I guess the basic or the main takeaway is that the US is heading towards self-sufficiency. That's the main takeaway. The other point is that the OECD countries, the demand is beginning to plateau. In fact, it's beginning to dip, but it's certainly peaked. So from the GCC perspective, there will be no increase in demand for their crude, for their exports, for the petrochems, for the foreseeable future. That part of the relationship has almost sort of served its purpose. Of course, the US still has strategic interest in the region, and that's something that we can just touch upon towards the end of the presentation. But if you bring those two factors together, rising Asian economies, shale gas revolution in the US and North America more broadly, then we can see that the transactional, the economic relationship between North America and the GCC is either plateauing or diminishing, whereas the relationship towards Asia is growing and growing, exponentially in fact. As a consequence, we've seen Asian demand upon GCC energy imports increase. Out of the approximately 13 million barrels of crude oil per day produced by the GCC, over 2/3 are exported to Asia. South Korea and Japan are the most heavily dependent on Gulf crude and currently receive 70% and 80% of their oil imports from the GCC. That shows how dependent they are on the GCC. Massively dependent. That's why the GCC is so important to their well-being. In 2012, China imported over 36% of its oil from the Gulf, while Gulf oil exports comprised approximately 45% of India's oil. Again, staggering figures, looming staggering dependencies there. GCC is a very, very important region, maybe diminishing in importance from a direct energy supply perspective from some of the Western states, but it's gaining in importance to the east. It's definitely looking eastward. Oil exported from Saudi Arabia to China and India consisted of 20% and 19% total imports in 2012. Again, phenomenal. Saudi Arabia essentially meeting a fifth of China's oil imports. That's a very, very strategic and important relationship that's beginning to burgeon. The trend is growing and is clear for all of us to see. Up to 90% of GCC oil exports could be destined for India and China as these markets mature. 90%. That's unbelievable amount. Chinese demand for oil is projected to grow by 3.6% annually between 2012 and 2030, and by 1.29% between 2030 and 2040. Indian demand for oil is expected to grow by 2.6% per annum between 2012 and 2040. So, we've established that the Asian economies are energy hungry, and the GCC states can partially satiate that hunger. More importantly, though, GCC and Asian states have made a number of strategic investments in joint ventures that will cement their futures together over the coming decades. For example, in 2012, Qatar Petroleum, QP, took a $4 billion stake in a petrochemical complex in Vietnam. QP was not alone that year. Kuwait Petroleum joined forces with a local Vietnamese firm and a Japanese partner in a refinery construction project in Hanoi, valued at $9 billion. In Thailand, Qatar Gas and Thailand's oil giant, PTT, have recently concluded a 20-year LNG contract. Not to be outdone, Saudi Aramco, in a joint venture with Sinopec and indeed ExxonMobil, have established a refinery and petrochemical plant in Fujian worth something in the region of $3.5 to $4 billion US dollars. The plant will process 160,000 barrels a day of Arabian sour crude. Now that joint venture is really interesting and shows part of the strategic thinking that's coming out of Saudi Arabia, certainly from the economic, from the energy perspective. You take a Chinese company, Sinopec, you take a US company, ExxonMobil, join them together. Saudi Aramco is the glue that brings those together. Invest in a downstream refinery petrochems project in China, so you guarantee a place for your exports, 160,000 barrels a day at least minimum, absolute minimum going there. So you cement that relationship. But most intriguing of all, I think, is that you bring in the US partner into that relationship as well. So making sure that you keep a key in the door to that relationship, but developing out in China. I think that's a strategic investment and a very important one. It's not all one way. There are plenty of examples where we see Asian money, Asian companies investing in the GCC. Some of my other colleagues will be looking from Asia to the GCC, but just one project of note, again talking about Sinopec. Yanbu Aramco, Sinopec Refining Company, has built a refinery in Yanbu which will process up to 400,000 barrels a day of Arab heavy from Manifa oil development. That will begin production in 2014. The growing economic relationship between the GCC and Asia is not only confined to energy, but other trade more generally. This is notable. Total trade between the GCC and China grew to $155 billion in 2012, which is 16 times larger than trade in 2001. Trade between the GCC and India rose 29 times to $159 billion in 2012. 29 times. I mean, it's just unbelievable. East Asia now accounts for over 57% of all the GCC's external trade. While the US and the EU together accounted for about 85% of trade with the GCC in 1980, this number has shrunk to 21% now. From 85% to 21%. That tells you the direction of travel. During the same period, total trade with Asia grew to 57% by the end of 2012, up from 10% in 1980. I will say that again. Up from 10% in 1980 to 57% in 2012. Staggering statistics. Overall trade between the GCC and East Asia, which includes, in this case, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China, grew from $480 billion in 2008 to $814 billion in 2012, nearly doubling in 4 years. Now, I've thrown a lot of statistics at you there, but one thing is clear. The direction of travel is very, very clear. There's a movement, a clear, discernible movement away from the West towards the East. It's hard to see that trend reversing. We can only see that trend intensifying. The economic relationship, the investment relationship, and the energy dependency will certainly bind the sub-region of the GCC states and those Asian countries for a long time to come. So the direction of travel is very, very clear. It's a trend that has developed over the past 10 years and is clearly going in one direction. It's very hard to see a reversal of that trend. So the next question is, at what stage, if or when, will the nature of the relationship change? At what stage will the GCC states and the Asian states look to thicken that relationship? I believe that the GCC states may want to accelerate that process, but the Asian states, as such, may be reluctant to do so, particularly at this phase of their history. Of course, this conversation, in a sense, has come about for two reasons. One is because of the shale gas revolution, which I referred to earlier, and the insecurity that may amount from that, this idea that the US becomes energy independent. There are many reasons to discount that. Of course, it will become self-sufficient. But as we've already alluded to, the GCC energy markets are eastward looking, and there's more than enough demand to satisfy there. But that sort of sensitized, I guess, the leadership to some of these issues, particularly around continued US engagement in the GCC or in the MENA region more generally. Now, of course, coupled with that has been the reaction or the response from the US, from the UK, and from other European partners towards the Arab Spring. And in my travels with Chatham House to the various capitals across the GCC states, it's abundantly clear, and will be abundantly clear to all of those in the room today, that there are some key vulnerabilities, some key concerns about the reliability, as I say in my abstract, of Western partners to come to the aid, come to the support of the GCC states. The issue around Egypt and the US seemingly pulling the rug from under Mubarak's feet cannot be underestimated, in the sense that suddenly the US has been seen by many in the region as a fair weather friend. Of course, that accusation is also thrown at other states, including the UK, in the region. Issues over Syria, and particularly the way in which the chemical weapons issue, the use of chemical weapons, was resolved, has created consternation amongst some of the GCC states again. Most clearly Saudi Arabia, who felt betrayed that the US had, or Obama had apparently pledged a response, but then backtracked from the Saudi perspective and moved back on that. This has created some key concerns, some vulnerabilities, and has led many of us to question whether this is the moment when the GCC looking east takes a different form, whether the GCC states themselves will start to look for an alternative security arrangement. As I said at the outset, I think in the early days when this thinking was coming about, certainly the questions in my mind were, how would GCC leadership be able to transfer its trust that it had invested within the Western powers to those in the East? The transfer of trust is not an easy thing, of course, particularly when it comes to security, particularly when it comes to providing that overarching umbrella of support that those states have enjoyed for so long. But I think the real question, certainly the one that I'm beginning to feel, one that I'm beginning to discern, is, do the Asian leaders, do those Asian countries really want to get involved in providing a security umbrella? I think the answer probably at this stage or phase is no. Professor Niblock, who sat amongst you today, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Tim, could probably unpack a little bit more about the Indian position and maybe contrast that to the Chinese position. I've heard him discuss that very eloquently, and he may sort of help us understand the difference there. But of course, when we're talking about Asia, when we're talking about the East, I'm sure you've talked about this in earlier sessions, we can't lump them together. There's competition amongst those states. Those economies are all growing at significant paces and rates. There are lots of issues to be played out amongst those states, as we know. So how that competition impacts or impinges upon the GCC states is not clear. And of course, whilst we're talking about the GCC, looking east, we can't ignore where Iraq fits into that picture, where Iran fits into that picture. We have to look at that sub-region, if you like, as a whole. Iran has very strong relations, or has really good relations with China. Iraq has developing relations with the Asian states. So do we see them as complementary, or do we see them in terms of competition? That's all to be played out. Anyway, I'm going to leave my point here. I've taken up more than my 10 minutes. I hope I've given you something to think about, and I will be very, very interested to hear your feedback and perhaps get some of your questions when I next speak to Professor Atashami. So on that point, I'll say thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I look forward to seeing you all at some other point. Thank you.